Frank's world exploded into agony as consciousness clawed its way back. The first sensation was pain, unrelenting, white-hot pain that seared through every fiber of his being. It felt as though his very essence was being consumed by fire, each breath a struggle against the torment that threatened to overwhelm him. Through the haze of excruciating sensation, Frank became aware of his surroundings. He was lying in the battle-scarred trench, the uneven surface digging into his back. The acrid scent of burning flesh mingled, assaulting his senses and making bile rise in his throat. As his vision cleared, shapes began to resolve themselves. 3 figures stood over him, their uniforms marked with the dirt and grime of battle. 2 of them held him down with grim determination, their faces twisted in cruel amusement as they watched his agony with detached satisfaction. The soldiers had taken advantage of his unconsciousness, pouring gunpowder into his wounds and igniting them to cauterize the injuries shut. The searing heat and acrid scent of burning flesh mingled with the smoke of battle, a sensory onslaught that threatened to overwhelm him. 2 soldiers, their faces twisted in sadistic pleasure, held him down with an iron grip on either side. Frank gritted his teeth against the pain, his muscles tensing involuntarily as he fought the urge to thrash and scream. Their laughter, harsh and mocking, echoed in the hollows of the trench, a chilling soundtrack to his torment. In the midst of his agony, Frank's gaze locked onto the 3rd soldier, the apparent leader of the group. The man moved with a deliberate calmness, a cigarette dangling lazily from his lips as he surveyed the surrounding battlefield with detached interest. The casual way he lit the cigarette, the flicker of flame illuminating his features briefly, sent a shiver down Frank's spine. Before Frank could fully comprehend the gravity of his situation, the soldiers on either side of him yanked him to his feet. The abrupt motion sent a wave of dizziness and renewed pain crashing over him. He staggered, his vision swimming as he struggled to remain upright. Through blurred eyes, Frank saw the twisted wreckage of the armored personnel carrier that had nearly claimed his life earlier. The memories flooded back. The blinding flash of the explosion, the deafening roar of metal tearing apart, and the chaotic fate of the soldiers surrounding it. The sight of the mangled vehicle, still smoldering with tendrils of smoke rising into the sky, was a stark reminder of the brutality of war. Bodies of the soldiers charred to the ground, frozen like mannequins in a theater of eternal suffering. Some being burnt down to the bone, completely unrecognizable as to their former selves, now just a morbid display of sacrifice. Frank's pain was relentless, a constant reminder of his vulnerability. Every movement sent a fresh wave of agony radiating from his wounds, each breath a struggle against the throbbing ache that threatened to overwhelm his senses. He fought to stay focused, to find a weakness in the soldiers' guard, but their vigilance was unwavering. The leader exhaled a cloud of smoke, the gesture casual yet filled with unspoken menace. He spoke a few words in a language Frank couldn't understand, prompting a burst of laughter from his comrades. The sound cut through Frank like a knife, fueling his determination to defy them. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled resolve, Frank tensed his muscles, preparing to break free from their grasp. Every fiber of his being screamed for freedom, for escape from the grasp of those who sought to break him. He would not be a pawn in their twisted game, would not submit to their brutal machinations. The leader's eyes narrowed slightly as he watched Frank struggle, the cigarette smoldering between his fingers. There was a calculating gleam in his gaze, a hint of amusement tinged with something darker. Frank met his stare with defiance, refusing to let fear dictate his actions. A gunshot rang out in the distance, a stark reminder of the chaos that engulfed them. The soldiers' attention flickered momentarily, their grip on Frank momentarily loosening. It was all the opportunity he needed, but Frank had waited too long. Another soldier came from out of sight, striking Frank's head with the butt stock of his rifle, knocking Frank unconscious again. Frank's awareness slowly returned amidst a storm of agony, his head pounding with each heartbeat. He felt the ground tremble beneath his boots, a sign he was being dragged away from the trench. The soldiers held onto his arms tightly as they maneuvered him across a grim landscape strewn with shell casings, spent rocket tubes, and the remains of fallen comrades. The battlefield, once familiar, now lay transformed beyond recognition. Craters marred the earth in every direction, stark evidence of relentless artillery barrages. Splintered trees lay scattered like shattered bones, their once green canopy reduced to charred fragments. Burning vehicles sent billowing plumes of smoke skyward, casting a somber veil over the scene of devastation below. Bodies, both intact and broken, canvassed the scarred terrain, silent witnesses to the brutality of war. Frank grimaced in pain, the throbbing in his head exacerbated by blood trickling into his eyes from a previous blow. His vision blurred, making it difficult to discern the details of his surroundings. Amidst the chaos, questions raced through his mind. Where were they taking him? Why hadn't they abandoned him to join the countless others left to perish on the battlefield? Frank discerned that he had been extracted from the trench when he noticed the ground feeling smoother underfoot, a stark contrast to the jagged, debris-strewn floor of the shattered defenses lined with remnants of war. His vision, poor from the blood, slowly recovered. His head throbbed in agony and body weakened from the blood loss. Frank's mind continued frantic thoughts of what the enemy had in store for him. The soldiers abruptly halted, releasing Frank with callous indifference, causing him to crash face first into the coarse dirt. Pain exploded through his body as the impact jarred his senses awake. Before he could gather himself, a soldier's boot struck his legs, kicking his knees with brute force. Blood streamed from a gash on Frank's forehead, blurring his vision as he looked up at the hostile faces of the enemy soldiers surrounding him. Their expressions were hardened masks of hostility, devoid of any trace of mercy or empathy. One soldier gestured sharply with his weapon, silently commanding Frank to kneel properly. Reluctantly, Frank complied, feeling the rough ground beneath his bruised knees as he lowered himself. His hands, tightly bound in front of him, restricted his movements, the rough ropes cutting into his skin, a constant reminder of his captivity. As he knelt there, Frank's gaze shifted to the others around him. 3 men, like him, were bound and battered, their uniforms torn and stained with blood. Each bore wounds that spoke of the brutality of combat, bruises, burns, and deep cuts etched into their weary bodies. Their faces conveyed a mixture of pain, fear, and resignation, their eyes hollow with the horrors they had endured. 2 of the men were clad in tattered camouflage fatigues, barely recognizable as remnants of friendly forces. Their uniforms spoke volumes of the hardships they had endured, torn and stained with the grime of battle. One of them, his eyes wide with desperation, exuded a haunting sense of terror that seemed to border on madness. His partner, on the other hand, bore a countenance of fierce determination and simmering anger. With fire in his eyes, he spat defiantly at the feet of the enemy soldiers, hurling curses and vows of vengeance into the air. The third man wore the charred remnants of a pilot's jumpsuit, the fabric marred with stains that looked like a mix of vomit and dried blood. Despite his disheveled appearance, there was a quiet strength about him as he knelt in silence, his gaze fixed grimly on Frank. His flight vest, torn and bloodied, still displayed a readable name tag, Captain Price. He appeared worn and battered, yet there was an unmistakable air of resilience and danger that seemed to radiate from him, reminiscent of Frank's own hardened demeanor forged over years of combat. As they knelt together, bound by ropes and the grim reality of captivity, each man bore scars, both physical and emotional, that spoke of battles fought and losses endured. The weight of their shared ordeal hung heavy in the air, mingling with the acrid scent of smoke and the metallic tang of blood. A heavy silence hung over them, broken only by the distant echoes of battle and the hushed murmurs of their captors deliberating their fate. The enemy soldiers loomed over them with an air of chilling authority, their gestures and whispers laden with ominous intent, as if deciding the destiny of mere pawns on a merciless chessboard. Fear tightened its grip on Frank's heart, mingling with the metallic scent of blood and the lingering smoke of war that hung heavy in the air. Each passing moment seemed to stretch taut with uncertainty, amplifying the dread coiling in his gut. Beside him, the other prisoners mirrored his fear, their collective anguish palpable in the stifling atmosphere. They were warriors stripped of their weapons and their dignity, prisoners now at the mercy of those who showed them none. Tension crackled in the air as the enemy soldiers grew increasingly restless, their voices rising in heated argument as they gestured repeatedly towards Frank and the other captives. Frank could feel the atmosphere shift, a palpable sense of uncertainty and urgency spreading among their captors. Amidst the escalating commotion, a figure that seemed to command authority strode towards the group of soldiers standing guard. He waved his pistol in the air, his voice cutting through the clamor in urgent tones that demanded attention. The soldiers around him quickly dispersed, their arguments quelled by the officer's decisive demeanor. With a calculated resolve, the officer moved closer to where Frank and the others knelt, his expression unreadable behind a mask of military discipline. The captives watched with wary apprehension, unsure of what his next move might entail. Just as Frank had feared, the officer raised his pistol to the head of the terrified soldier bound in front of him and pulled the trigger. Frank's ears rang horribly as he bore witness to the unspoken crimes of conflict. Blood sprayed out of the soldier's mouth and nose as the man's skull split open with ferocity, almost instantly dropping him in his footprint, leaving his body folded over itself, pooling blood rapidly on the ground at the officer's feet. The dead soldier's partner stared up at the officer in sheer awe and disbelief as he was delivered the same fate. His head snapping back violently, emptying its contents all over the sandbags behind him before rocking forward, exposing the empty cavity to Frank. The man's body never falling to the ground, but rather staying on his knees in a state of eternal prayer. The enemies had made their decision. Some lives are more valuable than others. Frank could only assume that he was kept alive as he had a different and more interesting unmarked uniform, unlike the regular forces fatigues worn by the men slumped over in a pool of blood in front of him. Captain Price would have important intelligence info for the enemies. Frank thought to himself it only made sense to keep Price alive, at least for now. Frank knew that pilots had particularly bad treatment when taken captive. One can expect to be tortured and probably face the same fate as the dead soldiers beside them. Though looking like a commando or special operative is not the look one would want to have when being captured either. It was obvious to Frank that both he and Price had a very long road ahead of them before their war would end. The officer turned toward Price, raising his pistol in the air before swinging it down violently into Price's face. Price giving no reaction, the hardened pilot defiantly stayed silent, never taking his eyes off of Frank. His glare spoke of an unspoken challenge of endurance between the two of them. The officer then turned to Frank, looking him in the eye before doing the same. Frank's head was battered and bruised already, this new strike adding to an unwanted collection of already excruciating wounds Frank had adopted since he began his journey through the trenches. As Frank grimaced in pain, the officer holstered his sidearm and proceeded to dig in Frank's pockets. The map, Frank's prized possession and entire reason for existence on the battlefield, fell out of his shirt and onto the ground at the officer's feet. The officer picked the map up and stood tall to view his findings. The officer seemed to recognize the map right away and folded it up quickly and placed it into his pocket. The officer called out to a few soldiers that were inspecting the wrecked armored personnel carrier as he simultaneously lit a cigarette, blowing the smoke right into Frank's face. Frank glared back at the officer, shooting the man a grin as if they were old friends. In that same moment, a burlap sack was forced over Frank's head from behind, taking him by surprise. Frank's journey into captivity had only begun, the officer now in possession of his prized map, his tireless effort stolen from him with ease. Frank's senses were assaulted by a sudden thud that reverberated through the air, hinting at Captain Price's collapse. In the same breath, a brutal impact struck the back of Frank's head, unleashing a wave of disorienting pain that sent him crashing to the ground, plunging him once more into unconsciousness.